Hello, everyone. I'm Martin Andrews, Communications Director at inquirED, and welcome to today's webinar, Background Knowledge and the Science of Reading. We are so glad you could join us. This is part of a series, our spring series, Building Background Knowledge, Literacy, Democracy, and Community. Our series is presented by the National Council for the Social Studies and inquirED. And I encourage you to come back for our 3 remaining webinars in the series. Next up, we'll dig into one of our favorite topics at inquirED, supporting students as they grapple with complex texts. We'll look at the research and examine the practical strategies to help students get the most out of their interactions with complex texts. Next, we'll be joined by Melissa Marks to explore how to use diverse books and inquiry to teach history. And finally, in May, we'll talk with award-winning author Dave Eggers and illustrator Sean Harris about their book, What Can a Citizen Do? And we'll be visited by several classroom teachers who are using their book to help their students impact their communities. You can sign up for those webinars at inquirED.org/webinars. The webinar series is also brought to you by inquirED. inquirED has created Inquiry Journeys, our elementary social studies curriculum to move students and teachers beyond the textbook, supporting culturally responsive instruction, inquiry-based teaching and learning, aligning to national social studies and ELA standards, and containing high quality and diverse content and sources. And you can actually now sign up for a free trial of a unit at inquirED.org/free trial if you would like to explore this literacy-rich social studies curriculum. We have a great webinar set for you, and I'm going to welcome on today's moderator, Sarah Schwartz. She is a reporter at Education Week, and amongst many of her interests and writings, she has spearheaded Education Week's coverage on evidence-based reading instruction, distilling psychology and neuroscience research into explainers and actionable stories that have since been used as teaching tools in schools, districts, and organizations around the country. And Sarah, your articles have definitely zoomed around the Slack channels at inquirED, so we feel really lucky to have you as a moderator today. Welcome.
Oh, thanks so much, Martin. I'm happy to be here and excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to introduce our guests in a moment, but first I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. So the idea of background knowledge is a huge topic, so I think it is helpful here that it's situated within these conversations about the science of reading. I'm assuming most of you are familiar, but if you're not, there is an ongoing movement to align reading instruction to evidence-based practices. And a lot of this conversation so far has focused on foundational skills in reading instruction, in part because a lot of the practices that were being used in schools to teach word reading weren't effective or were misguided. But of course, reading is more complex than just foundational skills, than just phonics and phonemic awareness. And there's a lot that research can tell us about best practice beyond those foundational skills. There's an analogy that I'm going to borrow from Claude Goldenberg, who's a professor emeritus at Stanford, that I like to use. So foundational skills are kind of like the foundation in a house. And if you don't have that foundation in a house, anything that you try to build is going to fall down. But on the other hand, a foundation alone is not a house. It's just a slab of concrete or whatever foundations are made of on the ground. And so to have a house, you need to build upon that foundation. And so when we talk about background knowledge in reading, that's part of that house that gets built upon that foundation. Research shows us that background knowledge about a topic plays a big role in reading comprehension. And that has led some researchers, some advocates to push for curriculum in English language arts that aims to build background knowledge systematically in history and science, about society, this understanding about the importance of background knowledge has kind of driven that push. So I want to talk about what this means for social studies teachers, what this means for the intersection between English language arts teachers' work and social studies teachers' work, and what the research base does and doesn't tell us about implications for practice. So I'm going to introduce our guests here today. So first up, I have Nell K. Duke. She's considered one of the world's foremost experts in early literacy education. Her career has been focused on the right to literacy, particularly the ways in which early childhood, birth through age 8, education can set children on a path to literacy proficiency. For 24 years, Nell served as a professor of education and psychology, first at Michigan State University and then at the University of Michigan. In 2018, Nell was awarded the International Literacy Association's highest honor, the William S. Gray Citation of Merit, for outstanding contributions to literacy research, theory, policy, and practice. She has been named one of the most influential education scholars in the US in EdWeek and has been involved in a wide range of initiatives designed to reshape literacy education. She's currently serving as executive director of the Center for Early Literacy Success at Stanford Children. We also have Katherine Tarca. She's the director of the Office of Literacy and Humanities at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, where she leads a team dedicated to supporting excellent instruction for all students in Massachusetts in the areas of English language arts, literacy, history, social science, civics, and the arts. Prior to joining the state agency, Katherine worked in public schools in 3 states and the District of Columbia for 14 years, including traditional public schools and charter schools. In that time, she was a teacher, literacy coach, and curriculum director. And then we have Shanti Elangovan. She's the founder and CEO of inquirED, an education startup focused on ensuring all students, regardless of geography or circumstance, have the opportunity to engage in high-quality inquiry-based learning. As a former elementary school classroom teacher and instructional coach, Shanti believes deeply in high-quality instructional materials that provide both the professional learning and support teachers need to bring inquiry to life in their classrooms. Shanti holds a Master's of Education from Teachers College, as well as an MBA from the University of Iowa. So thank you all. I'm really excited to talk with you about this. And I, at the risk of starting off with a kind of wonky question, I want to ask, Nell about the research base around knowledge building and specifically the difference between correlation and causation. So we know that that background knowledge plays a big role in reading comprehension, and that students who know more about a topic can read more, they can comprehend more easily a passage about that topic. What do we know about the effect of teaching background knowledge? Does that improve reading comprehension, or do we just have this correlation?
That's a great question, Sarah. No surprise. And indeed, the correlational case for the relationship between knowledge and achievement in reading is high. But in terms of causation, we have fewer studies, but we do have research studies that would suggest that teaching knowledge actually builds comprehension. So for example, we have studies that if you teach the core vocabulary and concepts in a passage and then have children read the passage, they'll comprehend that passage more effectively. We also have a number of studies, growing number of studies, in which there's an intervention for children that includes knowledge building in science and or social studies as like a core component of that intervention. And so far, those have tended to have effects on reading comprehension as well. So the case is definitely growing. I think a key point to make is that we have a long record of research on integrated instruction that includes both teaching aspects of reading, such as teaching reading strategies or teaching text structure, and building knowledge like in social studies and science. And that body of literature is much more robust and clearly shows positive effects of integrated instruction. So integrating reading and writing into science and social studies looks very good from a research perspective.
What is the difference between this integrated instruction and perhaps a knowledge building English language arts program?
It's a great question. So a knowledge building English language arts program may include some science and social studies as well as reading instruction. But more of the research has been done where it's science or social studies driving the bus. So our science or social studies goals are the preeminent goals of the work. And the literacy instruction that happens is in the service of the science and social studies learning, or in the context of the science or social studies learning. My own point of view is that that latter model I've described is a really important way to go. That is, we really shouldn't have English language arts curriculum developers deciding all of the science and social studies that gets taught in elementary classrooms. We need science and social studies education researchers and experts being at the table determining science and social studies that gets taught. If we rely only on the English language arts curriculum, we see, at least so far, some real gaps. I mean, one of them is that English language arts curriculum developers may not know all the research in how children develop in their scientific knowledge or their social studies knowledge. So there's that. We often see that certain disciplines are neglected. For example, you're much more likely to see history represented in content-rich English language arts programs than you are economics. But economics is also a very important discipline within the broad umbrella of social studies. Another thing that sometimes doesn't happen is that if you're just in an English language art curriculum, you may not see as much attention to things like understanding primary source material, contextualizing source material that you would see in high quality social studies led instructions, because social studies educators and researchers really recognize the very, very profound importance of those skills. So to sum up, I would say there's nothing wrong with integrating science and social studies into English language arts, but it wouldn't substitute for having parts of our day that are really driven by science and social studies, with literacy taught in an integrated way that sort of supports the learning.
Okay, I want to back up a little bit here. As I've heard you talking about, I want to get back to this question about who is kind of, as you said, driving the bus, but as you brought up different topics and different skills, I think it would be helpful to hear a little bit from everyone about kind of setting the scene for what we're discussing as the purpose of teaching background knowledge, and how that relates to social studies. So both what the research has, but also what assumptions states and districts are working under. So are we saying social studies content is important because it has the potential to raise literacy scores? Are we saying interdisciplinary learning would improve English language arts and social studies instruction? Are we saying something else? Kind of how are the ways that we're thinking about, I guess, the frame for the purpose of this work? So I'm wondering if we can go to Shanti first, then Katherine, and then Nell.
Oh, sounds good. Thank you. Now you kicked us off with all the things. I love it. Thank you, Nell, for kicking us off. That was awesome. So I'll just say that it's all of those things. It's social studies matters for the sake of social studies. We were actually debating the name of this webinar series, and Martin, who is lovely about naming our webinar series and thinking about that, was adamant that we had to have the word democracy in the series name, because what we didn't want to do, especially for folks that social studies is near and dear to our hearts, is to say ELA, let's teach social studies for the sake of ELA. That's not what we believe. That social studies matters for those skills and the disciplinary knowledge that you're gaining and all of those pieces of it. So, and it also matters for ELA. And when we talk about the entry points that Nell is talking about, is that while the research base has shown us that starting with the content area and really thinking about how we build skills to get us scaffold to really accessing the kinds of complex text that we use in disciplinary areas like social studies, what we actually see in the market is the opposite of that, is that we actually see in the market that we're going to content-based literacy programs that are taking up really large parts of the day and so many hours of instruction that it's making it impossible for many schools and districts, and Katherine can speak to this being at the state level, that schools and districts are saying, I don't have time for this other thing. So whatever social studies is in here, whatever science and is in here, that's enough kind of thing. I'm sure Katherine can speak more to it just being at the state level, but we hear that a lot from our partners, where are we supposed to fit this in? I've got this 3-hour ELA program that's taken almost a day. And now with a really push for phonics, I've heard some folks, I heard from a colleague of Katherine's actually, that he was in a building and there was 40 minutes of phonics instruction happening a day. It just doesn't add up. You're not going to have enough hours in a day. And so we've got to really question ourselves of how we're using that time.
Yeah, I can chime in on that. You're totally right, Shanti, and I've observed and heard those same stories. So I want to second what Nell said and what you also said, Shanti, that social studies is critically important in its own right. And speaking as the person who leads policy for both ELA and social studies in Massachusetts, I would never, ever want to cut back social studies in order to give additional time to ELA. For many years now, kind of since Reading First, or even before that, since NCLB, ELA has gotten all the time. And in some cases, social studies is cut entirely, which is really tragic and inappropriate and not well serving our children as individuals nor our society. So we want to see that stop, and we want social studies to have its due time. To go back to your question, Sarah, about why are we having this conversation? Is social studies in service of ELA, vice versa? Social studies in its own right is critical, but we should also acknowledge the hidden, I guess you could say, or dual benefit of learning that occurs in social studies, civics, history, the arts, sciences. They all build students' conceptual knowledge base and related linguistic base that then translates to enhanced abilities in their reading and writing. So that's not why we're doing it. That's not why we're having rich arts programming or rich science programming or rich social studies programming, but that benefit is real. As all texts assume knowledge, right? No text contains every tiny little piece of knowledge that the reader would need to comprehend it, because texts would be exceedingly long and boring if they were written that way. There's always embedded or assumed knowledge where the reader has to make some types of inferences or draw conclusions based on what they already know. In kindergarten or first grade, the text can be pretty simple, and just basic life knowledge may allow children to make those inferences. But once we get to 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, the texts are increasingly topical. They increasingly draw on knowledge of the world, society, history, even science. And students who haven't had the opportunity to learn richly in those content areas will actually have more and more trouble than even engaging in texts that are classified as ELA texts, fiction or nonfiction. And so that hidden or secondary benefit that also boosts their literacy and reading and writing ability is there alongside with the value of the content learning itself.
Ditto. Social studies really important in its own right, and the specific ways of making sense of texts that are typical within social studies disciplines, really valuable in their own right. And then there's this added benefit, as noted, to support just general development of vocabulary, reading, and writing. We haven't mentioned writing as much, but you write better if you know more about the topic. That's pretty well established. So you can see, again, where we have a benefit of knowledge building for literacy development. I do feel the need to say, I think everyone on the call, would agree, but just important to say in those early grades, we do need to have time for explicit systematic phonics and spelling instruction, because kids aren't going to get good at reading, writing, or doing any sort of major sort of literacy work within social studies if they can't read and spell the words, right? So we do need that time. I think the challenge is that some places are overblowing how much time that should take. And then they're adding in this really large ELA block on other aspects of literacy development. And as already noted, that's taking up, just too much real estate in the day. We can talk about various solutions to that, but just wanted to put that much on the table.
Okay, so we have this critically important piece of phonics and spelling instruction. We have the usefulness and the need of content-rich content in English language arts, and that it's important to also have time in the day for social studies. And I know it's not the focus of this, but time in the day for science as well. So Katherine, can you talk a little bit about how Massachusetts is trying to balance all of these different priorities while also being able to kind of align throughout the knowledge that students are learning. It sounds very complicated. Can you talk a little bit about how you're working on that challenge?
Yes, the biggest and most frequent challenge we hear about is time. So I think educators increasingly really are confronting the importance of each individual component that has to be part of literacy instruction, foundational skills, engaging with complex text, writing, and then knowledge building, which can occur within the ELA curriculum as we've discussed, but we don't want it to only occur there because that can lose the sort of disciplinary specificity that needs to occur when you're reading and writing specifically within a discipline like social studies or science. So we also need social studies, we also need science, the arts, health, and other important experiences in the elementary grades. So we all know time is a huge concern. Some of the most successful approaches I've seen have time held sacred for discipline-specific, content-specific work in science, in social studies, and then kind of spread the remaining time between ELA and math. And sometimes that leaves, let's say 90 minutes for ELA. It requires the ELA instruction to go at a really brisk clip, not having 40-minute phonics lessons like Nell referenced, but having 5 to 10 minutes of really active, fun, engaging phonological practice, jumping right into phonics instruction with a lot of active practice, jumping right into fluency with a lot of active practice, and then spending the bulk of the time reading and engaging with and discussing complex text. So I know when I taught, I was probably spending too long on phonics, long leisurely discussions of like, what are all the words that begin with W? We don't really have the time for that type of thing anymore. All of our minutes really have to be purposefully used, and time for each discipline does need to be held sacred. I think one of the biggest missteps we frequently see is the idea that we don't really have time for social studies, so we'll just lump it in with ELA, and our ELA curriculum will pretty much cover enough of the important social studies topics. So I hear a phrase I hear frequently is like, at least they're getting a taste of it. At least they're getting exposed to it. At least they're getting something. But even the educators that are feeling forced into that decision, I think acknowledge that it's not the rich type of social studies instruction that they want students to be receiving, and it lacks that disciplinary edge.
Are there other models, and Katherine, you could speak to this, or Shanti or Nell, other models for organizing a school day so that all of these pieces fit together and that there's enough time for everything? I feel like, that's like the $1 million question. So, if you have a quick and easy answer to it, that'd be great. But also I understand that, that's always a challenge.
Nell, I'm going to set you up here to talk about the work you've been doing. But so theoretically, the ideal solution might look like a curriculum that integrates the content areas, the social studies, the sciences, and the arts with reading and writing, doing disciplinary work in those areas. The trick is that the reading and writing occurring in the content areas would have to align with the skills and knowledges that we want students to be building in the content areas. It's really tricky to design a curriculum like that because it's local specific and state specific. For instance, in Massachusetts, in 3rd grade, our curriculum standards are focused on local Massachusetts history and other topics that are not as richly taught in other states because they're like kind of local. So it would be difficult for a nationwide curriculum developer to come up with a curriculum that met our needs here in Massachusetts, like that was centered on our Massachusetts history, but also addressed all the reading and writing standards that needed to be happening in that grade. However, if that were to be constructed, I think that would be sort of the, I hesitate to say magic bullet, but that would be a powerful solution that could address some of our biggest problems, which really are about time.
Would that be an ELA curriculum? Would that be a social studies curriculum? Would that be an interdisciplinary curriculum?
I suppose it would be interdisciplinary because it would have the disciplinary features of reading and writing while also the social studies or the science that's being worked on. And Nell, I know you're trying to build this, so maybe you could share with what you've been up to.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for that setup. I am just so sympathetic to some of what I'm seeing in the chat, and I hear all the time, there really aren't enough hours in the day. And when teachers are being given separate curricula for social studies, science, usually several different curricula these days just for literacy, and then math, and then maybe SEL as well, and they're trying to weave these all together, but they weren't written to coordinate. Oftentimes, it is really challenging. So what a large team of collaborators and I have been working on is developing a full day birth through age 8 curriculum. So for example, our kindergarten curriculum, all of them, but they're bell to bell. So inside that one curriculum is English language arts, literacy foundational skills, the math, the science, the social studies, SEL, and also some attention to social justice, so that it's really not left to the teacher to try to figure out the difficult task of getting these things all squeezed in, and the challenging task of figuring out how to get them coordinated. So we have parts of our day, and I think everyone, on this webinar who teaches young children needs to have parts of the day that we have just literacy foundational skills. We have 20 to 30 minutes a day that's whole group spelling and phonics and phonemic awareness instruction that, as Katherine said, great, really like a brisk pace, really keeps it going. So we have that. And then children are going off and they're doing small group work. And, some of the time they might be working on their handwriting, for example. We have some sort of more literacy sorts of pieces. But oftentimes what they're doing is they're working on their literacy with texts that are coordinated with the science and the social studies. So for example, we have decodable texts synced up to our phonics scope and sequence, but the decodable texts are also on the science and social studies topics that they're learning later in the day. Anyway, but that's it for literacy. I mean, it's kept pretty modest in terms of the amount of time spent for just literacy as literacy. And then we have a large block of time that goes to science and engineering part of the time, or to social studies part of the time. And we integrate literacy and math and so forth into that time. So basically what we've done is had the hypothesis that controlling the whole day is better than trying to coordinate a whole bunch of different curriculum programs that may not have been, coordinated. So A, and B, that most of your English language arts instruction can actually happen in science and social studies. There's really not that much that you have to teach separate from what happens in the English or in the social studies and science block. So that's what we're trying to build. But as Katherine noted, there are certainly lots of challenges. And one of them is that kindergarten through second grade social studies standards differ from state to state. So that's one of our challenges.
I'm wondering maybe Shanti or Nell, if you can talk about what it looks like to teach literacy practices and strategies through social studies content. What a couple of examples of that might look like.
Yeah, one thing I'll jump in with too, kind of is not exactly the question that you're asking, but hopefully will get me to an answer to your question, Sarah, is that I think there's a thing that we need to differentiate when we talk about the building background knowledge in a subject like social studies versus it just in ELA for ELA's sake. Is in ELA, for example, if you look at ed reports, they'll talk about text, complex text, complex text, complex text kind of thing. In social studies, we often talk about sources, and that widens how we can build background knowledge. We can build background knowledge through media clips, through video clips, through audio, through lots and lots of things, sometimes through independent readers, through the read alouds, lots of different ways that we can build that background knowledge. And so as we're thinking about how students might be grappling with the complex text, they've done lots of different things. I think of it as like our tool belt is like all of the different things. They might have read a text on their level, lexile level, and they might have done that, but they also may have heard a read aloud, and they also may have listened to this video, and all of those things are coming together that are allowing them to come to that complex text. And our next webinar, actually, I'll put a plug in for it, is about that layers of meaning. And then really coming to that complex text in a way that allows them to come with all of that knowledge that can be challenging if we're just talking about ELA, right? Because we're just thinking about, well, I'm reading this text before, and so I've only got this kind of one tool belt. Maybe I've got, this teacher doing a read aloud or students independently reading, but I don't have as many on my tool belt of things that I could bring to building that background knowledge. So when we come to that complex text, though, we're going to think about a lot of different things. And I think, again, it goes back to Nell's point of what the research tells us is the entry point, right? So if I'm entering from the content area versus the ELA skill, I can be thinking about, okay, we're reading this complex text and we're building it in sequence to what we've been learning about. We've been building up to this complex text about the American Revolution, whatever that subject area is. And then I'm thinking about in my ELA, like, how have I scaffolded towards that? How have I thought about the main idea of this text? Those kinds of things that can really help me better unpack this text. And I've thought about the knowledge there. When we go and we think about it from the ELA space, what can happen is we're kind of doing that absent of the knowledge. The knowledge happens to be there, but we're thinking like, let's jump to the main idea. Let's jump to these things. And what we're not doing is like really sequentially building up towards that thing in the same way of being able to really spend deep time just thinking about, we're not assessing on that content knowledge. We're assessing on the ELA skills. And we're not really thinking about like, did the students get that? Are we sure that they got that part of it so that when they come over to this independent complex text that we've really built that thing? So it's a kind of a circuitous route to what your question is, Sarah, but I think that to me really gets at why this kind of entry point for social studies can really help build those ELA skills as well versus starting from the other angle.
So one thing that I'm seeing a lot in the chat that I think relates to this is the idea that ELA is a tested subject, whereas social studies very often is not. And so if you are an ELA teacher and you say, okay, there are these reading comprehension skills that I need to make sure that my kids can apply on a test. And then you're trying to incorporate this idea of knowledge building, and you're trying to kind of, Shanti, as you were saying, sort of like flip the orientation from focusing on teaching the skills, and you might come across some knowledge, to focusing on teaching the knowledge, and then you apply these skills in that process. How do you do that if also, perhaps an off-the-shelf curriculum product might not exactly line up with your social studies standards, and you're kind of trying to figure out how to piece together all of these things in real time?
Yeah. Now you want to jump in, or I can jump in. I'd say it's really unfair. We're asking teachers to do really unfair things. I think it kind of goes back to my original point of like, if you're handing them a curriculum that's, taking up 3 hours of their day, and I want to really emphasize the point, I agree very much with phonics instruction, and that really setting aside time is really important. What I think my point was like, how are we thinking about the hours and the minutes that this is all adding up to for teachers? And when we look at the equation, we're way over the number of hours that are possible in a school day, the number of minutes of instruction. And so we've kind of got to reconfigure that day. Nell's program is awesome. If you haven't looked at it, it's amazing. The challenge is like that, how do we get districts to move to that degree? And so when we talk to our partners a lot and thinking about social studies, we'll say, all right, you've got this complex text here that you're thinking about. So, and we call ourselves we kind of flip the idea of a content-based literacy program and said we're a literacy-based content program. And so there's a lot of literacy that's happening in our curriculum. And so the ideal would be that there would be, that they wouldn't have a thing that doesn't connect. That the idea would be that those two things connect. And we hope that as an industry, we'll get to that space. But as you said, there's a lot of barriers to that because of the way standards are and things like that. But when we think about what teachers can be doing right now, as we look at that content, there is some space where we can say, okay, what am I doing in my ELA? It does take some extra work. And I think it can be done also at the district level. And what we've seen some really great district leads, I think some of here that are on this call have really helped map that for their teachers. They're like, okay, you're doing this here. And so how are you going to be thinking about this skill over here? Or maybe just swap that text over here. And so you're thinking about a text here that can really help you build towards this other thing. Can be really hard though. I really really want to acknowledge that you've got this set curriculum, and Inquiry Journeys, our own curriculum, is a set curriculum that's hard, that has all of these things in it. And so you're trying to map these two things, and we're asking teachers to do a lot more when they already have too much on their plate. So I say it with a complete, huge grain of salt that like that's a challenging thing. And I think that we've, as vendors, have really got to figure out a better way to be doing this for teachers and for schools and for students.
Katherine, I wonder if you have anything to add from kind of your what you've seen around the state.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a realization that when we measure things like finding the main idea or students' ability to make inferences about a cold text that they've never seen before, we're not measuring what I used to think we were measuring. I used to think that main idea or making inferences or drawing conclusions was a discrete skill that could be kind of like equally applied and equally measured after it was taught with any text that you put in front of the reader. I no longer think that's true now that I've learned that background knowledge or knowledge affects comprehension broadly. And you can check me on the research, Nell, whether I'm getting this right. But I think if my understanding is correct, that sort of like really, really strong, broad conceptual knowledge is connected to better reading comprehension overall. So if we spend time, or if this is a good time to mention the baseball study, right? The old seminal study that found that students who know a lot about baseball were higher achieving in their reading of a text about baseball than students who were supposedly good readers but didn't know much about baseball. So that knowledge about baseball was more meaningful than the sort of isolated skill like finding the main idea or making inferences. So if children have broad conceptual knowledge of the world, of society, of how things work, they'll be more successful reading all different kinds of texts, including the random text that may be put in front of them on a reading test. So having learned more about that perspective, I now feel more strongly about the value of large sets of texts that are connected that allow students to build their knowledge, deep conceptual knowledge of a topic over a longer period of time. So with ELA curricula or with social studies curricula, we look for spending a substantial period of time on one topic, allowing students to engage with it, talk about it, read about it, write about it a bunch of days in a row with a bunch of different sources or texts, as opposed to the older or outdated style of ELA curricula, which would have maybe 2 or 3 texts on a topic or a quote unquote paired text set, or sometimes even just a random new text every day. That was when we were working on skills. That was before today's day and age where we're trying to build knowledge, sometimes at the same time as building skills. Sometimes we're just focusing on the knowledge, which in and of itself has a lot of value in contributing to reading ability.
One thing that when you were talking about the large connected text sets, one thing that came up for me is something that Gina Sorbetti, who's she's a professor at the University of Michigan, said to me for a story I was working on, which is that she was kind of hypothesizing that the way that knowledge might aid in reading comprehension is that if you have 2 texts about things that are connected, that kind of helps you make inferences or make those connections or make those contrasts. It kind of is a vehicle for you to do that. So like, for example, if you're, I'm just coming up with this example off the top of my head, but like if you're reading a story about car manufacturing or an article about car manufacturing today, and you're trying to make a connection to car manufacturing in the past, it's going to be hard for you to do that if you don't know anything about car manufacturing in the past. But if you have 2 articles, one about car manufacturing today and one about in the past, like then you can use both of those texts as a vehicle to make that connection because you have all that information at your fingertips. Now, am I misinterpreting
No,
the
you're dead
research?
on, and that study
Okay.
is so relevant to what Katherine was saying, or that now it's a line of research. They have several studies, and that's exactly right. Everybody, if you randomly assign children to read a set of texts on the same topic or conceptual theme, children develop better in terms of vocabulary and comprehension than if you give them an equal number of texts, but spread out across a bunch of different topics. So you're exactly right. And I think that's really great research to lift up, Sarah. So I'm glad that you did that, and Katherine as well. I did want to go back to the main idea and inferencing piece. So, I mean, I think exactly right, that knowledge that you have has a huge impact on your ability to figure out what the main idea is, to make inferences, all those things. However, there is a large body of research that it is also helpful to teach kids to make inferences, and it is also helpful to get kids to look for the gist or the sort of main point that an author is making. So this is one of those both and situations where we need to be building knowledge, and we also need to be teaching comprehension strategies and text structure. And one of the things that's worrying me a lot right now is that the field seems to be having trouble holding both of those in their head, along with literacy foundational skills, right? Like, so, you know, it's just a strong tendency in our field, at least in the early grades. I know there's some middle and high school folks on the call, and I'm not so knowledgeable about what happens there, but definitely in early ed, we have a tendency, like, we go too far toward literacy foundational skills like phonics and spelling, and we start to neglect comprehension. Or we go too far on comprehension strategies and we neglect the knowledge building, or we go too far on the knowledge building. You know, it's just this cycle, and it's so tricky for us to keep all of those in mind. And then, as has been raised so many times now in the chat, it's just so hard to actually achieve. And Shanti, you explained this so well. I mean, it's just such an incredibly difficult task. You know, the math doesn't add up, I think you said, in terms of like how to get all of these to happen. And I just want to add a layer to it, that I tried to do this thought experiment in which I took chunks that research suggests you should spend, you know, like this amount of morphology instruction is really helpful to kids. This, you know, amount of vocabulary instruction is really helpful. This amount of science is recommended. You know, some of you might know the Council of Chief State School Officers Social Studies Collaborative says 45 minutes a day for social studies, like full stop. That's you know, minimum. So I took all those numbers and I added them up, and it creates a school day that is, I think it was close to 9 hours. And that didn't include like transition times and like all these other things that need to happen. And we all know that's unrealistic. So in the chapter, what co-authors and I tried to do is then to introduce or emphasize, not introduce, this has been introduced before, but this concept of instructional simultaneity or instructional density is basically like how much instructional power can you pack into any given moment. And the ideas that have been shared on this panel so far are good examples of instructional density, where you're like, you know, feeding 2 birds with one hand, or 3 birds with one hand, or 4 birds with one hand. You're taking a moment and having it do double, triple, quadruple duty. And you can't always do that, as noted with some of our phonics instruction, for example, but a lot of the day you can do that. And so I think that might be a useful heuristic for us to start asking ourselves as a field, is like, what's the most efficient or most sort of impactful for the amount of time approach we can take? Or I've said it's sort of like, you know, with literacy foundational skills instruction, instead of trying to make it take more and more and more time. So we spend 90 minutes teaching phonics. Well, we spend 120 minutes teaching phonics. Like, instead of that, more like a name that tune. Like, how few minutes can you get it down to and still develop kids who are really good at reading and spelling words? Like, maybe that's kind of the angle that we want to take. The last thing I wanted to say about instructional density is just that in the research on highly effective teachers of literacy, one of the things that comes up over and over again is that they just use time really well. Their transitions between activities tend to be shorter. They tend to have like organizational systems that involve children just being able to get to the next thing that they need to do in a really sort of seamless way. They tend to have more multidisciplinary instruction going on. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from these really profoundly excellent teachers, many of whom I'm sure are represented on this webinar audience, you know, in terms of how to make the best possible use of the day so that there is time for all of the things that we know need to happen.
I want to ask one more question that is on my mind, has also come up a little bit in the chat, and then I'm going to pass it back to Martin because we are nearing the end of the hour. But So one question that comes up a lot with these conversations is if you are trying to make an ELA, a content-rich ELA block, what knowledge are you trying to teach during that time? And I think a lot of our conversation, we've kind of been talking under the assumption of alignment to social studies standards, right? So so that can kind of this collaboration between social studies teachers and ELA teachers can kind of drive the what content you're focusing on in ELA class. But even if you're taking that framework, you're still making some decisions, right? You're thinking about what in social studies do we want to be focusing on twice or more, or what do we think kids are going to want to write about and talk about, what is important for the group of kids in front of us in our state, in our city, in our community. And those are really value laden questions. And they're also kind of politically, especially politically tense right now when there is legislation in more than half of states restricting the ways that teachers can talk about race, can talk about gender, can talk about issues that are deemed as controversial. So I know this is a huge question, but like, how do we go about making those decisions, and who gets to make those decisions? And whoever wants to take that first can go ahead.
I'll leave the who gets to make the decisions to other folks on the call. But I think what I will say is there's been this thing, I love what Nell said about like, we have this really hard time in education of holding multiple things in our head. And I think this is true about background knowledge. So when you talked about the baseball study, if we talk about these things or the car mechanic idea, things like that, these are all knowledge. And what has happened is we started to equate history with knowledge. There's become this idea that it's about historical knowledge. And that has actually, I believe in the roots of where that came from, because we moved away from teaching a lot of history in the early grades. And so that's fair to say, is like, we've got to think about where that history is. And a lot of the standards have really moved away from that. And that is a challenge. I think a secondary thing happened is social studies became not very rigorous. And so there was no time. And so it was like, here's a handout to draw your community. And that's not rich, rigorous social studies. So it's not, I don't believe that learning about our community is not knowledge. It is knowledge. Learning about economics is knowledge, but how are we doing that rigorously? And social studies is geography, it's economics, it's history, and I'm missing something, civics. Thank you. So my civics people get very upset with me if I forget civics. But so all of those things are knowledge. And so I think we just got to be careful in this moment to not try to shove ourselves totally just like all of everything should become history, and that's the only knowledge that matters. I think it's really important to think balanced in this way that we tend to not do well in education. So I'll kick it to these folks, because as a vendor, I don't get to decide. I have to follow what states tell me is there. So I'll let these folks weigh in on that side of things.
Well, I'm very eager to hear what Katherine has to say, because I imagine she's been like deep in that process at a state level, and in this country, right? Like social studies standards are really state-based. We have that C3 framework, but as we all know, the C3 framework wasn't meant to stand alone. And so it gets animated at each state, at the state level. So I'd love to hear more, about that process. I think everybody would benefit. But I just wanted to underscore something that well, really the question from Sarah, that just it does matter whose knowledge we're talking about. And it matters the breadth of it, as Shanti indicated, like we are seeing neglect of some, at least in the early elementary grades, we're seeing more neglect of some social studies disciplines than others. But it's certainly also broader than that. Like it's a values question, as you said, Sarah. So like, do children have a right in school to learn about the history of the cultural group or groups to which they belong? That's a values driven question, right? There's no amount of research that's going to fully answer that question, because it really has to do in a lot of ways with our priorities. So my answer would be yes. Not everyone in our country shares that belief. Right. But Katherine, you want to tell us more about like how do state standards, how is the sausage made at the state level?
Well, I'm proud of our state standards in Massachusetts. I mean, I'm sure this is true of all states, but just speaking for us, it's a multi-year process that involves engagement and comment from hundreds of stakeholders, and a really concerted effort to ensure that the voices of historically marginalized stakeholders or groups are heard when we're setting the state standards. But even with state standards for something like social studies in the lower grades, we know that they're often not all addressed, and educators at the classroom level, school level, or district level are sometimes still picking and choosing or adding to the state standards depending on how much time they have. I do think relevance has to be elevated in this conversation. So there's the opportunity to focus on the standards that are the most relevant to students' lives, communities, and cultural and linguistic funds of knowledge. There's also the opportunity with any topic that you're studying to find connections to students' lives, to find connections to relevance. So whatever topics are selected, there's an opportunity to look at it through the lens of relevance and making it relevant, culturally relevant for students. That's something we really prioritize in Massachusetts. And the other thing I would name is diverse perspectives and sociopolitical awareness. So sociopolitical awareness is a term that perhaps is more used in certain areas of the country at this moment, less used in others. But it's a priority for us in Massachusetts to give students opportunities to understand the world around them, how it works, why it works the way it works, the history of our social structures, and the way that those structures manifest around us today. So whether we're doing ELA or social studies, we look for curriculum to provide opportunities to look at the world through a sociopolitical lens, and think that's really important.
I feel like we could keep talking about even this specific question all day, but I'm going to pass it back to Martin because we're nearing the end of the hour here. And just thank you so much, Shanti, Katherine, and Nell for being in this conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah. And we have tons of questions and 3 minutes to get to all of them, which is not going to happen. So I just want to maybe float a couple ones that are out there. And then also, I just want to, Emily, if you have a link to the survey, because we're going to do a little survey, just a feedback survey that you can put in the chat for folks, that would be great too, so that we can follow up on that while we're talking. So one of the questions that came from our Q&A section of the site is that speaking up for science and social studies, I have been speaking up for science and social studies until the cows come home. Do you have evidence of states or individual districts that have begun this switch that you're talking about? Like, and I think she means the true integration that we're talking about wholeheartedly. I have a hard time getting school leaders on board with science and social studies leading the way. So are there examples of states or districts that you know of that are really doing this work that maybe some of our participants can point to when they're leading the fight for this in their own schools and districts? Anyone? Oh no, there's no schools and districts out there.
Well, I'm
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Shanti, please.
No, you go.
I was just gonna say, I'm hesitant to call out any particular district or school, honestly, but what I would say broadly is that districts that are creating model schedules, for example, DC Public Schools has done this, developing model schedules that actually allocate specific amounts of time to different parts of the day and make sure that science and social studies are included. I think as a strategy, that's a great place to start. Like, what do you want? What do you expect the day to look like? Don't leave that to individual teachers to have to fight that battle on their own. Take a stand at the district level and then provide the supports needed to achieve that model schedule.
I'll just also reiterate, just adding to what Nell's point, is the point about vendors and myself included, we're not doing a good enough job for students right now, because we've got to figure out how to better utilize that day. And so the district can only do so much. If they've got however long that ELA program is, this program, and the minutes don't add up, there's just only so much breaking of those models that they can do and still have that be a high quality instructional material, still have that do all the things that we want it to do. So I think the truth is that like districts there are a lot of districts that are doing their best out there, but we've got to really think about what are the kinds of materials that we're producing, because that's supposed to be our role. role. Like we can't expect districts to do all things. And so we've got to be providing more interdisciplinary resources that really help support that.
That's great. We had a question from a second grade teacher that who said it feels like she's encouraged to go an inch deep because of the time issue. And she wondered if reducing the number of concepts that she's required to cover, maybe in social studies and other things, and going more in depth would be an argument that is not only something that it seems like a common sense argument, but is there the research to back that up, that actually spending more time on something and going deeper into it, it leads to better outcomes?
The short answer is I don't think that we have the kinds of longitudinal data on that I wish we did, right? Like where we randomly assign kids to two really different curricular models and then see what it looks like to them long term. But it does give me an opportunity to just say that a lot of whether we think inch deep or mile wide is going to be, mile deep or inch deep, let's just say, whether that's going to be effective is really going to depend on what measures we use. And a major problem right now is that state tests of ELA and honestly many state tests of science and social studies aren't well aligned to the standards. And so what you get is the sort of they incentivize an inch deep instruction because you never know what's going to show up on that test. So I am enthusiastic about some policy work, for example, in Louisiana, in which the effort is to reshape state ELA tests so that they line up with what's actually on the science and social studies in the science and social studies standards. So that would be one recommendation.
It's interesting too, like if you look at Dr. Kim's research, the kind of distant, like the farther effect from, and Sarah writes about this recently in an article from EdWeek, is that farther effect is harder of like, okay, so I've read about something and I have a short amount of time to explain this, but like the further and further I get from that content, we're seeing less of an effect. I think that I don't know, Nell would know better than I would. Is there research saying that there is that like longer distal effect? It doesn't seem to be there's that research, but what I guess I would say is like, I think by going an inch deep in those content-based literacy programs, I would say they're going further than an inch, but they're not, but there's a time factor and they're jumping from subject to subject. And so that would have an effect on that distal piece of this. And so we think about year after year and more knowledge building deeper and deeper, that I believe that you will see, if we did research on that, we'd see a distal effect. But again, we got to do research on it.
I'm going to give our participants time to fill out their exit ticket. And while they do that, I'm going to go around with this last thing is that I've been doing this in our webinars and I've just been calling it, what are you jazzed about? So I'm going to go around this group. Maybe you didn't prepare, panelists. So what is either something that is the book on your nightstand, something that you are into right now that is inspiring you, giving you hope, changing your perspective and thoughts about something? So I will start with Shanti. I'm going to start with you. What is something that you've just discovered? And we'll go around, and everybody else, you can write these down because they might not be in the blog. So
I'm just going to take the opportunity to kiss up right now and say, I'm really excited that Sarah's writing about background knowledge. I think there's a lot of writing right now that is a lot of the media is attention on phonics. And I don't want the message of this webinar to be that I don't believe in phonics. I believe very deeply in phonics. But we've got to hold all of these things true in our head at the same time in education. And so there's just not a lot of media about this right now. It's very focused on phonics. And when I hear from parents, especially non-educators, they're like, oh, what this means is that we just need to teach phonics. And I'm a little scared of that messaging and what that's going to do to our classrooms and swinging that pendulum too far. And so I just want to say, I really appreciate Sarah and doing that. So I'll just totally kiss up right now and ask you to keep doing that. Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Nell, how about something that you're reading about or interested in or inspired by right now?
Yeah, I read a meta-analysis, and if you follow me on Twitter, you already saw this tweet, but it was a meta-analysis about ways you can develop reading fluency that don't involve repeatedly reading the same text over and over again. And I'm excited about that because there's a place for repeated reading, but doing that wider reading is also looks really promising in research and is something we can do very easily in science and social studies.
Could you put your, if you have a chance, panelists, could you put your any social handles in the chat? Because it would be great if people could go there and check that out. Katherine, what's something that you're inspired by or into right now?
This is not that new, but I'll name it for the folks on the call who focus on ELA primarily, and that's the Educating for American Democracy framework, a big coalition of educators and scholars who focus on civics and social studies came out with this framework around civic education and civic preparation that is really powerful and inspiring. Highly recommend. If you're not usually in the social studies space, it's a great place to dip your toe in and learn more. And then Goldie Muhammad has a new book, which if you read her first book, it was wonderful and really enriched my thinking. And I've just begun her second book, which I'm excited to finish.
Oh, that's great. And Sarah, what about you?
Okay, so this isn't directly tied to the topic of what we're talking about today, but I am working on a story right now about tutoring, and one of the districts that I talked to, one of the ways that they had recruited tutors was having some of their tutors recruit at their retirement communities. And I just thought that was such a cool, interesting idea. A way to connect older folks in the community with younger folks. And I got to talk to some of those tutors, which was really interesting.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much, panelists. Sarah, Nell, Katherine, Shanti, thank you so much for joining us today. It really was a great conversation.